Have you ever felt like the harder you try with an avoidant partner, the further away they seem to move? You send the thoughtful text. You try to explain your feelings. You offer reassurance. You even give them space when they ask for it. Yet somehow, nothing seems to bring them closer. In fact, many people make the mistake of believing that if they just love an avoidant partner a little more, communicate a little better, or try a little harder, everything will finally change. But what if the very thing you're doing to bring them closer is actually pushing them away? Today, we're talking about something that most people never understand about avoidant attachment. And no, this isn't about blocking them. It's not about making them jealous. It's not about begging them to stay. It's about one powerful shift that completely changes the dynamic between you and an avoidant partner. Because when you understand this, something interesting happens. The avoidant no longer feels like they have all the control. And for the first time, they begin to feel the emotional impact of their own distance. Let's start with a truth that can be difficult to hear. Avoidant people are often used to others chasing them. They're used to partners constantly trying to fix the relationship. They're used to receiving long emotional messages. They're used to being pursued after they pull away. Over time, this pattern becomes familiar to them. When they create distance, they expect the other person to close the gap. When they become cold, they expect someone else to warm things up. When they disappear emotionally, they expect their partner to keep reaching. Not because they're evil, not because they enjoy hurting people, but because that's the relationship dynamic they've experienced over and over again. And here's where most people make a huge mistake. The moment they feel the avoidant pulling away, they panic. They start checking their phone every few minutes. They send extra messages. They seek reassurance. They try to force conversations, and without realizing it, they reinforce the very cycle that's keeping them stuck. The avoidant pulls away. The anxious partner chases. The avoidant feels pressured. They pull away even more, and the cycle repeats. But what happens when you stop participating in that cycle? What happens when you stop trying to force connection? What happens when you stop making your emotional well-being dependent on their response? That's when things begin to change. Because the one thing that hits an avoidant partner harder than begging, harder than pleading, harder than emotional ultimatums, is your genuine emotional independence, not fake independence, not pretending you don't care, not playing games, real independence. The kind where your life doesn't stop because they're distant. The kind where your happiness doesn't depend on a text message. The kind where you continue growing, living, and moving forward whether they're emotionally available or not. And here's why this affects avoidance so deeply. Many avoidants are comfortable managing distance. They're comfortable handling emotional pressure by withdrawing. But they're often uncomfortable when someone quietly stops chasing them. Because suddenly, the familiar pattern disappears. And when the pattern disappears, they can no longer predict what's going to happen next. For perhaps the first time, they have space to actually feel the consequences of their own emotional withdrawal. And that's where everything begins. In part 2, we'll talk about the specific behavior that makes an avoidant partner start noticing your absence, and why most people ruin it by acting too soon. Now here's where most people get it wrong. After hearing advice about giving an avoidant space, they decide to back off. But deep down, they're still waiting, still watching, still hoping, still checking their phone every 10 minutes. They're physically giving space, but emotionally, they're still chasing. And avoidance can often sense the difference, because real emotional independence isn't about what you do. It's about the energy behind what you do. When you stop chasing merely to get a reaction, you're still focused on controlling the outcome. You're still revolving around them. You're still waiting for them to validate your worth. That's not the shift we're talking about. The shift that truly affects an avoidant partner is when your focus returns to your own life, when your attention stops being consumed by what they're doing and starts being invested in what you're doing. Think about it. When an avoidant partner starts pulling away, many people unknowingly place their entire emotional world on hold. They stop enjoying their hobbies. They stop being present with friends. They lose focus at work. They spend hours analyzing texts, looking for hidden meanings. Their entire life starts revolving around one question: what is my avoidant partner thinking? But the moment you redirect that energy back toward yourself, something powerful happens. You stop operating from fear. You stop operating from scarcity. And you start operating from self-respect. Suddenly, your day isn't determined by whether they text. Your mood isn't controlled by their attention. Your sense of value isn't tied to their approval. And that's when the dynamic shifts. Because avoidants often expect emotional pursuit. They expect you to keep reaching, to keep checking in, to keep proving your commitment. When that pattern disappears, they notice. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, but they notice. Why? Because human beings naturally become aware when something familiar changes. Imagine hearing a clock ticking every day for years. You barely notice it, but the moment it stops, the silence grabs your attention. That's exactly how many avoidants experience emotional pursuit. The chasing becomes background noise. It's expected, predictable, normal. Until one day it isn't there anymore, and that's when curiosity begins. Not because you're playing games, not because you're trying to manipulate them, but because you're no longer feeding the pattern. Now here's something important. This doesn't mean becoming cold. It doesn't mean ignoring messages. It doesn't mean acting like you don't care. Those are games. And avoidants are often highly sensitive to games. The goal isn't to punish them. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself. There's a huge difference. One approach says, I'll stop talking to them so they'll miss me. The other says, I'm no longer going to neglect my own life while waiting for them to show up emotionally. The first is manipulation. The second is self-respect. And avoidants can feel that difference more than most people realize. Because self-respect creates emotional gravity. It makes people take you seriously. It communicates that your life has value independent of the relationship. And that's something many avoidants secretly admire. In part 3, we'll discuss why your calmness affects an avoidant far more than emotional reactions, and why staying composed can become your greatest strength. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about avoidant partners is believing that intense emotional reactions will finally make them understand how much pain they've caused. So when the avoidant becomes distant, many people respond with frustration. They send long paragraphs, they demand answers, they explain their hurt again and again. Sometimes they cry, argue, or plead for clarity, and while those reactions are completely understandable, they often create the exact opposite result. Because avoidants are usually overwhelmed by emotional intensity. The more pressure they feel, the stronger their instinct becomes to retreat. It's not that they don't hear your words. It's not that they don't know you're hurting. In many cases, they do know. The problem is that emotional overwhelm triggers their defense mechanisms. And once those defenses activate, genuine connection becomes much harder. This is why your calmness can be so powerful. Not because you're suppressing your feelings, not because you're pretending everything is okay, but because you're demonstrating emotional stability. You're showing that your emotions belong to you. You're managing them without forcing another person to carry them. And that creates a very different experience for an avoidant partner. Think about it this way. Most avoidants spend a large part of their lives expecting emotional pressure whenever conflict appears. They expect criticism. They expect demands. They expect guilt. They expect emotional escalation. So when you respond with calm confidence instead, it catches them off guard. Because you're no longer participating in the familiar dance. You're no longer trying to force understanding. You're no longer trying to squeeze reassurance out of someone who isn't ready to give it. Instead, you're standing firmly in your own emotional reality, and that sends a message far stronger than any argument ever could. That message is, I care about this relationship, but I also care about myself. Avoidants often struggle with vulnerability, but they also pay attention to strength, not controlling strength, not aggressive strength, quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need constant validation, the kind that doesn't collapse when someone becomes emotionally unavailable, the kind that remains grounded regardless of what another person chooses to do. And here's something few people talk about. When you react emotionally every time an avoidant pulls away, the focus stays on your reaction. But when you remain calm, the focus shifts back onto their behavior. Now they have room to notice what they're doing. Now they have space to reflect. Now they can't hide behind the distraction of conflict. Your calmness removes the smoke from the room, and suddenly, the reality of the situation becomes harder to ignore. This doesn't mean you'll never feel hurt. Of course you will. You're human. The goal isn't emotional perfection. The goal is emotional ownership. To feel your feelings without letting them control your actions. To experience pain without abandoning your self-respect. To care deeply without losing yourself completely. That's a level of emotional maturity that many avoidants secretly respect, even if they never say it out loud. And often, it's that maturity that starts making them see you differently. Because while emotional reactions are common, emotional composure is rare. In part 4, we'll reveal the one thing avoidants fear more than being chased, and why it often becomes the turning point in the relationship. At first glance, it might seem like avoidants are afraid of closeness. After all, whenever relationships become emotionally intense, they often pull back, they create distance, they become harder to reach, they need space. And because of this, many people assume that intimacy is their greatest fear. But the truth is more complicated. What many avoidants actually fear is losing control of their emotional world. They fear becoming dependent on someone. They fear vulnerability. They fear needing another person more than they'd like to admit. And that's why something unexpected happens when you stop chasing them. For a while, they may enjoy the extra space. They may feel relieved, they may tell themselves everything is fine. But eventually, a different feeling can start to emerge. A feeling they don't always know how to handle. Uncertainty. Because when you're constantly chasing an avoidant, they never have to wonder where they stand with you. They know you're there. They know you'll reach out. They know you'll try to fix things. The relationship may not feel healthy, but it feels predictable. And predictability feels safe. Now imagine that pattern suddenly changes. You stop begging. You stop convincing. You stop proving your worth. You continue living your life. You continue growing. You continue moving forward, and you do it peacefully. Without drama, without threats, without trying to make them jealous. For many avoidants, that's when reality begins to feel different, because now they can no longer rely on the assumption that you'll always be waiting exactly where they left you. Now they must face a possibility they rarely consider, the possibility of losing someone who genuinely cared, not because that person gave up in anger, but because that person finally chose themselves. And that realization can hit surprisingly hard. Why? Because avoidants often spend years believing they can manage relationships through distance, that they can withdraw whenever things become uncomfortable, that the connection will simply remain available when they're ready. But life doesn't always work that way. People grow, people heal, people move on. And when an avoidant starts recognizing that you're no longer organizing your entire life around them, it can force them to confront emotions they've been avoiding. Regret, loss, longing, curiosity, even fear. Not fear of you, fear of what happens if they keep repeating the same pattern. Now here's an important warning. This is not about making someone afraid to lose you. Trying to create fear usually backfires. The goal isn't to manufacture anxiety. The goal is authenticity. To genuinely build a life that doesn't depend on another person's emotional availability. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. Whether the avoidant comes closer or not, you win. Because your happiness is no longer trapped inside their decisions. Your peace is no longer controlled by their mood. Your future is no longer waiting for them to change. And ironically, that's often the moment they begin seeing your value more clearly than ever before. In part 5, we'll bring everything together and reveal the ultimate mindset shift that makes an avoidant respect you, notice you, and sometimes even move toward you again. So let's bring it all together. We've talked about why chasing an avoidant often pushes them further away. We've talked about emotional independence. We've talked about calmness, self-respect, and breaking unhealthy relationship patterns. But all of these ideas lead to one final mindset shift. A shift that has the power to transform not only your relationship with an avoidant partner, but your relationship with yourself. Here it is. Stop asking, how do I make them choose me? And start asking, are they choosing me? Read that again, because this is where so many people get stuck. They spend months, sometimes years, trying to convince an avoidant partner to see their worth, trying to earn love, trying to prove they're enough, trying to become more patient, more understanding, more available. But healthy relationships aren't built on one person constantly proving their value. Healthy relationships are built on mutual effort, mutual care, mutual investment. The moment you stop focusing on how to make someone stay and start paying attention to whether they're showing up consistently, everything changes. because your attention shifts from control to clarity. You stop obsessing over potential and you start looking at reality, not who they could be, not who they might become someday, but who they are right now. That's an incredibly empowering place to be, because avoidants aren't the only people capable of making choices. You have choices too. You can choose your standards, you can choose your boundaries, you can choose what kind of relationship you're willing to accept. And perhaps most importantly, you can choose yourself. This is the part many avoidants never expect. They're used to people waiting, hoping, holding on indefinitely. They're used to people making them the center of their emotional universe. But when someone develops genuine self-worth, that dynamic changes. Now you're no longer asking, how do I get them back? You're asking, is this relationship meeting my needs? You're no longer focused on winning someone's love. You're focused on building a life that feels fulfilling regardless of who stays or leaves. And that's powerful, because confidence isn't knowing someone will never leave. Confidence is knowing you'll be okay even if they do. That kind of energy is impossible to fake. People feel it. Avoidants feel it. Everyone feels it. And ironically, when you stop trying to force connection, that's often when connection has the best chance to grow naturally. Sometimes the avoidant steps forward. Sometimes they become more curious. Sometimes they start reflecting on their behavior. Sometimes they begin making efforts they never made before. And sometimes they don't. But here's the truth. The biggest victory was never getting an avoidant to chase you. The biggest victory was becoming someone who no longer needs to chase anyone. Because the moment you stop abandoning yourself for love, you become far more attractive, far more confident, and far more emotionally free than you've ever been before. And that's what truly hits an avoidant partner hard. Not blocking, not begging, not games. Just a person who finally realizes their worth and starts living like it.